some of the COVID-motivated migration that we've seen in the past year or so. And we're going to start with pre-pandemic migration trends. So leading up to the pandemic, what was the state of migration in the US? And then we're going to take a look at COVID impacts on migration itself, as well as the metropolitan trends in larger metropolitan areas. And we're going to use New York and Florida as our case studies, specifically New York City and Miami, and kind of explore the effects of labor force movements in those places. And they'll be the main cities for our hypothetical model simulation that we'll be running towards the end, followed by Q&A. So let's get started. So pre-pandemic migration. So figure 1, as you can see there, it comes from the Brookings Institute. It shows US annual migration from 1947 leading up to 2020. So smaller shares of Americans changed residence than in any year since 1947, and as a result of that steady decline that we see in that graph, it stood at about 9.3% from March 2019 to March 2020. And this decline was largest in the young adult population, so millennials. And that's kind of a counterintuitive, as young people aged 18 to 34 are the most mobile, as they have settled the least. They don't have families yet. They don't have long-term jobs. They're the most able to move, but for some reason they bore the brunt of the housing crisis and the jobs crisis. And so this sustained downturn in migration is due to a variety of demographic and economic forces, some being the rise in dual earner households, which leads to families being more rooted in where they are and being more happy with their living situation and less mobile, as well as an aging population and a more homogeneous labor workforce. And so if we break down the types of movement by within county mobility and between county mobility, we can see the difference here is that more people are moving within county, even though it is still decreasing. That is still a more common type of movement. Between county is less common, but it's also showing a slight decrease over time. And this is a smaller window in time, so it's from 2005 to 2020, that should be mentioned. And that longer distance migration is often due to a labor force change. So either you have a new job and you're moving to it, or you're being relocated for another job as well. And the within county mobility rates are often due to seeking a better home or more land or more affordable housing, as well as establishing a new household with a new family or a change in marital status or something like that. People will often stay in the same county, but just upgrade or downgrade depending on their particular situation. Moving on to COVID motivated migration. So once the pandemic hit, people kind of scrambled and moved around, and there's several reasons for that. The first being safety concerns. There was a major flight from density. So people left larger metropolitan areas to limit the spread of the virus and avoid higher positivity rates. They wanted to keep themselves safe. And coming with that is also the protection of elderly family protection. So people wanted to make sure their loved ones were safe. So there was a lot of migration back to their homes to stay with their elderly loved ones and protect them and take care of them while the pandemic took its toll. And along with the pandemic, with all the shutdowns, there were a bunch of economic concerns that came along with the pandemic. So the decrease in job opportunities, so an increasing lack of jobs and unemployment rates led to a lot of fleeing of cities, as well as higher paying jobs, leading to remote jobs and availability to work from home, allow people to move around freely and move to places where they've always wanted to live and have more space without having to pay the metropolitan rate of living, so avoiding those higher costs in the city. And also coming along with the economic concerns is the housing market, which, as we all know, has been red hot as of late. So the availability and affordability of land and housing units is due to a number of factors. The first being the Fed lowering mortgage rates and making it a good time to buy. And the second, people have shown a desire to move out of the city and have more land and a larger home. So the housing market has become a seller's market. And some other motivators that go along with all of this is the broadband resiliency and access. So people are moving places where broadband is accessible and strong, and so they can remain productive. They're looking at food security. They're looking at access to quality education for their families, as well as mentioned before, more land and a larger home. And now I'll pass it to Tristan to discuss the metropolitan trends.
Thanks, Julian. So with our metropolitan trends here, it's interesting to find that the metropolitan areas that attracted the most movers in 2020 were largely the same as the ones in 2019. So we'll talk a little bit later about how these trends are ongoing. But even just for 2019 and 2020, you can see that lots of New Yorkers, for example, are moving to smaller towns such as Kingston and Hudson. But out-of-state migration was more common in these larger cities like New York, San Francisco, Seattle, and Boston, though typically the people leaving did stay in their states. But we did see a difference in urban workers moving more so than suburban, which leads us to believe that it's more connected to home size and value, as well as this fear of dense populations. Additionally, we saw that the wealthier and more central neighborhoods had the biggest net outflows, whereas the lower income neighborhoods unfortunately don't have the freedom of mobility, so to speak. The good thing about this, however, is that it has stretched the boundaries of the labor market. With remote work, we've been able to open the door for a hybrid work schedule where maybe instead of commuting every single day, those living in the commuter zones in New York City, for example, might only need to go to the office once a week or twice a week, if at all. So we've looked at, for this study specifically, New York to Florida migration. New Yorkers have for decades been moving to Florida. However, it's usually retired populations that move. What's interesting about the past year and a half is that you're actually now seeing people who are working move to Florida, not just those who are finished. So that's been really interesting to go into, and that's what our demonstration is going to focus on today. All right, so in New York City, since January of 2020, we've seen a net loss of 100,000 people. From the stricter COVID sort of time period from January to December of 2020, that was a net loss of 70,000, but that number has since increased. And we say net loss because this doesn't factor for opportunists who are actually now coming into New York City, buying up the cheaper real estate. However, if we look from the period from 2010 to 2019, we see that New York State as a whole has had a net loss of 1.4 million people in the past 10 years. So that shows that these are trends, that COVID is not the only reason that people are moving. People have been moving. But like I said before, what's interesting and exciting to watch is that it's more and more of the working class and middle classes who are currently employed rather than retired. All right. So demographic-wise, again, mostly middle-class families in groups, more so than the young single worker. And we don't know if they will return. They might not. But I don't want you to go into this thinking that we're giving you a doomsday clock like the one in Union Square, because actually, surprisingly, the effects can be really positive, and migration isn't necessarily something negative. Now I'll hand it off to David to tell you about Miami.
Great, thank you, Tristan. So conversely, we're seeing people go into Miami from New York. That's what we're here to discuss. That's what we're going to look at in a few minutes with our analyst. So again, the numbers you're seeing from 2009 to 2013, there was an increase of 22,000 people. And like we've discussed, it isn't so much about the why, it's about when that happens, what are the effects? What are the policies that change? What are the shifts in population and demographics? So from September 2020 to March 2021, with that COVID variable, there's an additional 33,000 that's moved. So just in that one chunk right there from December 2020 to January 2021, that's that huge bulk, that massive increase, 145%. And where we're largely seeing that is in Palm Beach County, Broward, Miami-Dade. Now, the conversation surrounding that is going to come down to the high skill versus the low skill jobs. Are those who are able to move to Miami, are they seeking opportunity? Are they financial workers? Are these people who can work remotely totally, or can they have a flex job? And they have found that in Florida. But for one immediate understanding, we're seeing right away is the housing prices, the housing change, housing affordability in Florida. And these are ripple effects across several industries, but the conversation surrounding housing affordability has garnered a lot of attention. Specifically, price increases of 11.5% along the beachfront in Miami over these past 18 months. Now, what we attribute to that is this migration, but again, it's not the why so much, though COVID is the very obvious density solution and answer to that. There are other, the why not necessarily, again, it's just the effects of everything that's included. So it was $900 a square foot as before, and now what we're seeing are condominiums averaging about $1,000 per square foot. Let's move on to the next. Right, and so those general, just a refresher course, those general understandings, those general effects of labor force movement, you're seeing in the inbound movement, job shortages, labor surplus, and we're narrowing those skill gaps, but you are seeing a more diverse workforce. That lack of available quality housing, the increased housing and land prices, these all affect several industries, several categories, of which we will get into on that short demo that we'll show in a few minutes here. But then again, on those inbound movements, you're seeing the high resource consumption. So it's not just the big economic impacts, there's the smaller economic impacts too as well. And on the larger scale and a governmental scale, where are those public funds going? Are they still going to adequate health, transportation, and education facilities, or are they stretched too thin now? Who's getting the money? Who's receiving these funds that are meant for where they're meant for? Are they being received appropriately? And in the very obvious mirroring of that, the opposite, those outbound movements, what's happening there? There's a job surplus, there's a labor shortage, there's larger skill gaps now, less diverse labor force. These are changing population and demographic issues happening in two of our major American cities. And so again, those population shifts, those demographic shifts, they have major socioeconomic and fiscal impacts on the labor market as people move around, not the least for tax revenues and the overall economy at the state and local level. It's not, you're not just seeing effects at the state level, you're seeing it from your everyday merchant, from your everyday grocery store, from your everyday construction and maintenance crew. And so that smaller tax base in New York is now being appended in Florida with a larger tax base. So that does affect policy making, decision making, and an understanding of how can we interpret, how can we get ahead of these policy decisions that will affect us all. And one more thing to note, there's that regional difference that Haozheyi will get into. That's a very specific and interesting variable that a lot of people find intriguing. There's a regional difference in labor productivity from the high productivity of New York to the lower end of productivity in Florida, given the population and demographic differences. In New York, you are seeing a lot of financial workers, Wall Street, those who can work remotely with productivity, it's very high. And then in the lower end in Florida, there's a difference in those who can work totally remotely and those who have that flex hybrid option. So moving on again to answer this question, what is the importance of economic modeling? What can REMI offer? What are we here to understand? How can we get ahead of these things to better inform our policymakers and decision makers? So here at REMI, we do like to say there's three approaches to the importance of economic modeling. To clarify, you want to clarify these issues to yourself, to your company, to your organization, to your government, and none more so than to the people that you live with, your neighbors, your communities. And you need the software solution that simplifies that complex relationships between these policies and these variables attached to your local economy and the greater economy. Number two, you want to calculate these things. This is not, you want to be able to bring hard evidence, hard data to people. This is the best way to get people to listen to a project you want to get off the ground, or to have a greater understanding of where we're headed in the future. If we do X, what will happen with Y? So you want those macroeconomic policy models that allow you to analyze and quantify these inherently complex policy issues and solutions. And lastly, potentially most importantly, you want to be able to communicate this to people. You can explain these quantitative narratives to policymakers and to the general public with a tool like this, because there will be a visual component, there is a hard data component, there's any component that you would need for any kind of, some people are visual learners, some people want the hard data, and some people want the narrative. So quite honestly, the communication here is key. If you want to get a project off the ground, if you need something to happen, or to just essentially understand and analyze and interpret what's going on in your local or state level economy, communication is what's necessary. And some people respond to the data, some people want the visualization, but at the end of the day, an idea is nothing if you can't communicate it to someone that you're working with. And again, these population shocks of any kind, you want to be able to adapt timely and accordingly. Though the COVID situation, we don't want that to happen again. We don't want to see that happen again. You can't forecast something like that. It's good to have a tool like this in your back pocket should another population shock happen or a demographic shift happen. You can see what happens in the past, what's happening now, and potentially what can happen in the future. And so again, the why is important, of course, but we're not here to ask why people move or don't move. A percentage could be due to COVID, a percentage could be personal, a percentage could just be economic opportunity. What we're here to do is to understand those effects, both in the economic space and the demographic space. The forecasting and its results can prepare us for these shifts and shocks in order to amend and help inform our policymakers and those decisions. And lastly, before I hand it over to Haozheyi for that quick demonstration, this is a good look at the REMI model structure. Now, for those who are familiar with REMI, those accustomed to REMI, this is a very familiar site. What we're looking at is the model structure, the input-output flow of all these linking connections. And as you can see, there's the output and demand category, the labor and capital demand, population and labor supply, compensation, prices and costs, and market shares. Now, specifically for this demonstration, there will be more of a oh, I'm sorry. Looks like I was muted. I hope everybody heard those last few things I said. But for this, we are talking specifically where we're taking a narrower focus on that third block there for population and labor supply. And again, so this is just a linking connection of all the variables and all the data that go into creating and modeling that custom build for any client that wants to look at that economic impact and analyze what's been going on. And what's most important and what's most special about REMI's software and our capabilities is the dynamic effect. Not only can we forecast out to the year 2060, but it's a year-over-year interconnectedness between each policy change, between each data change, and it's not static, it's dynamic. You want to be able to look at that from year over year. It's a comprehensive look at these economic impacts and policy impacts. And so with that quick understanding of what's happening behind the scenes, I want to hand it over now to Haozheyi, and she will be giving us that demonstration.
Okay, so now we're reviewing my homepage of PI Plus. So as we already mentioned, we have this 3 regions model, and this is a national one. So there is a small map here. We have all the national, the whole United States, and also there's a Miami little down here. And before I get into the scenario, I can briefly introduce the control and simulation that we have. So for the control, we have regional control and national control. These are served as our baseline, and they kind of simulate the business as usual outcomes. And normally we will just create a new regional simulation if we want to simulate for different shocks. So for example, we could just simulate for the employment in this case. So I just pick employment and then select. So here we have several options, and we could just say it's in industry employment, and then the different industries. In this scenario, we have the finance, finance sector. So I will just pick the security commodity contracts. That's the finance sector that we have, and then for the region, could easily pick one region, and then we could input for the amount. Here it's pretty quick and easy. We have this calculator button on the right top. You could just fill in the value, and it will spread it out for all across all the 10 years. And then after finish this, you could just add to the inputs. Right, so here I'm just showing you how to input into in different simulations. And then we could go to the forecast options. We have this run forecast button, and then here we could run the forecast from different years. You can just drag this one, and then it will show different years that you could run. So as yeah, so here I just we could just hit the run button, and then the results will show you all the outcomes. Right, so I will just show you the results that I already have. So here is the migration event, the simulation that I created for you. So as I already mentioned, so we have these two very simple inputs. So we have a decrease in industry employment for the finance sector for New York by 10,000, and the same, it's like increase for Miami and the same sector for 10,000 jobs. So it's just to simulate the migration from New York City to Miami. Okay, here we go. Okay, so here we have this this economic impacts that I would like to show. So normally you could just go over, like, for there are different folders here. You could just see the snapshots. So the snapshots will show you all the economic summary table that we have, and then have different types of visualizations. We also have like detailed economic tables and detailed demographic tables. So they will show you like all types of demographic and economic outcomes. For the purpose of this demonstration, I just grabbed some very interesting outcomes and put it in the migration event I created, and I added in the favorites. So just to make it easier to present. Right, so here we can take a look at the economic impacts. The first thing that we may be really interested in is the employment by different region. So we have two regions here, Miami and New York. And just a quick reminder, we have inputted for 10,000 jobs for both cases. So the shock are the 10,000 jobs. For New York, it's about like 21,000 job loss. And for Miami, it's like 18,000 job loss. So the direct job impact is 10,000. And then all these regions have like a larger job impact, because other than the direct impacts, we also have indirect and induced impacts. For New York City, for example, there will be less business activities through the supply chain, and less household spending, consumer behaviors. So in this case, all these like directly induced dynamic responses will contribute to our total employment. So that's why we see like it's really larger impacts than the original shock. And then the net impacts, if we take 21 minus 21 and then add the 18, then the outcome is still negative. So the job increase for Miami cannot make up for the job loss in New York City. Yeah, and here is the employment, and then we could also break down the total employment by different sectors here. So here we have finance sector, and obviously it has it most be affected. We also have services. That's the second largest piece. Yeah, we actually have like different types of industries. So here it's only in here I'm showing in the sector level. Okay, so now we could go to the regional difference in these two regions that may help explain. And David also mentioned that. So we know like the job is only one part of the story, and here is the labor productivity table. I will show it by the levels, and then we see here it's showing the labor productivity for Miami and New York, and then we can see for the finance sector specifically, New York is like $400,000, and then Miami is only like 112. So all regions is the national level. So compared to the national level, New York is well above, and then Miami is a bit below the national level. So the 10,000 migration moving out of New York and then moving into Miami. So that means they are moving out of a higher productivity environment and into a lower productivity environment. So that could be a misallocation of labor and then reduce the overall work efficiency. So that's the labor productivity. And with the employment and labor productivity introduced, we could also have a look at the output. So here we could see the table down here. We could see like for the Miami, it's increasing. The output's like 2 billion increase. For New York, it's a larger loss. It's like 7 billion decrease in output. And as we know, like the output is the amount of production, so that kind of that can be thought of the supply side of the economy. So that suggests there will be more economic activities that happen in Miami, providing more goods and services. However, for New York, it will be less economic activities, and since New York has higher job loss and then also higher labor productivity, it's not surprising to see they have like greater output loss, because output is the product of labor productivity and employment. And besides that, we could also show the GDP by the region. So we have several lines here. The New York is in the New York is in the lower line, and then also we see the Miami is top here. So yeah, that's a pretty similar pattern than with our output. And then we could go to the income. So here is the income table that I show it for you. So I'm showing the earnings by place of residence. So for Miami, it's like about like 0.7 billion increase. For New York, it's like more. It's about like 1.6 billion decrease. For the income, obviously there will be income transfer when people moving out of New York and into Miami, and also the compensation rate is different in these two regions. So the same worker that earning less in Miami than they did in New York. So to prove that, I also have a compensation rate table here. So the compensation rate is we use the compensation and divide it by the employment. So the compensation rate show here is, you see the Miami is like I will show it in level just to better compare these two. And then, right, so the Miami is like a bit lower than the average, the national level, and New York is much higher than the national level. This is specifically for the finance sector. So here's, of course, the finance New Yorker earn like much higher than at national level. So all this can help explain like the labor income difference in these two regions. And then with all the labor income, we may be curious about like how people are gonna spend this money. So here there's a breakdown of personal consumption expenditures, and I'm showing for Miami. We actually have 75 commodities present here, and we could just sort this out by 2022. And we see here people are going to spend it in recreational activity and then healthcare, and also there's some housing. They're going to buy more house and food services for sure. Right, we can also do the same for New York. And I'm going to sort it out. So from the highest to the lowest, we see like the recreation services is the big loss, and then also the healthcare, other non-durable goods, and also housing. Right. So here is the compensation breakdown, and we may look at other components of GDP. So here is the investment. The investment has several different categories. So we have residence, non-residential, and equipment, and some like intangible property, some like property here. And obviously the residential takes a big part here. The same for New York City. We see the total is negative, and then the residential part is the most negative part. And that's for the investment. And lastly, I would like to introduce for the economic migrants. So here we see actually this 10,000 migrants will attract even more migrants to Miami. However, the New York will lose more residents in this case. So for Miami, that's a positive signal that because these new migrants will help shape the economy by bringing more tax bases, human capital development, and other like services. However, for New York, it may not be a good sign, and then it may probably decrease the regional competitiveness in this case. Right, so these are the results that I would like to show in this scenario, and I can hand it over to Julian.
Great, thanks, Haozheyi. Let me just share my screen again. All right, are you all seeing my screen? Apologies for not being in present mode. Sit down. All right, so some of the major conclusions from today's presentation, starting with the migration decline that we've seen leading up to the pandemic. There's still major questions around whether or not it'll continue after the recovery and after the vaccination efforts come to completion. We also might see labor markets expand to include their peripheries and those towns on the outside as the labor force can work from home and can go to a hybrid or flex work schedule. We also saw that labor movements have measurable effects on regional economies. Through Haozheyi's demonstration of the model, there's a plethora of ways that there's an effect on economies. And economic modeling, as we saw, is necessary to interpret and respond to these effects. It can help policymakers make the right decision and react accordingly. And a quick, very brief summary of what the demo showed is that there was a production decrease in New York City, overall increase in Miami, and a decrease across the US, largely due to the regional differences in labor productivity. We'd like to thank you all for coming today. We're now open up for a quick Q&A, and I'll pass it